history is the present and history is the future. In European systems, we have a linear approach to the world, an approach that makes one believe that history is something that is left behind. History is something that can be forgotten. No, ladies and gentlemen, history is never left behind. In the human mind, the history is now, and in the human mind, the history is present. For the future is made of things that were made in the past. Without past, there is no future. And so we must then see. So the Afrocentric view of the world is nonlinear. It is one that sees past, present, and future as simultaneous. And we must recognize this factor. Our knowledge of our history and our perception of our history is intimately tied up with our knowledge of our future and our ability to determine that future. To forget history and not to operate on history is not to control the future. Therefore, we will see then those who wish to control the African mind seek to control our perception of the future. The mind then is not only influenced by its inputs, but of course is influenced by its own native characteristics. It uses the sum of its currently available intellectual, emotional, and behavioral characteristics, and it brings those characteristics to bear on its environment and to affect its adaptation. It uses then its own potential powers. The control of the mind and related personality, their characteristic functioning and relationships to the world and self-perception is significantly achieved through the manipulation and the quantity and quality of inputs, through the structuring of its environment, through the manipulation of reinforcements and experience, and the control of its perceptions and interpretation of these perceptions, and finally through the feedback from its output. Let us make it simple. I only mean this then, that the mind essentially is controlled by the nature and quality, by the quantity of information that flows into it. It is also controlled by its native characteristics, by its thinking characteristics, by its reasoning characteristics, by its current mood state, by its current perception of itself and of the individuals, by its current perception of the environment, and it is also controlled by its expression, by its output. That is, when we express something and when we act upon the world, we look at the effects of our acting upon the world. How the world reacts to our action reflects back on our mind, and our mind is often changed and biased as a result of what we call the feedback mechanism. So then this gives us a basic insight then into how one controls the mind. You can manipulate the mind then in terms of manipulating the information that goes in it. And this is another one of the European constants I often talk about that is hidden behind what is apparent change, and that is the European control of information, which I'm sure you as an audience are very familiar with. We are still fighting to get the videotapes of the court scene on Like It Is or on TV, period. You're still fighting to get other information that you have in the Tawana Brawley struggles and other struggles on the public television. The Europeans, of course, are manipulating that information. Despite your election of mayors, despite your elections of governors, and so forth, the European still intends to control the nature of information that is available to the African mind. And since this mind operates on the basis of information fed to it, then the control of information by Europeans is an attempt to control the nature of the African mind. I was very happy at the time when the City Sun made a major coup in terms of the Tawana Brawley case. That was a monumental event, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you recognize the great historical value of that situation. For the first time, a black newspaper, I may not say the first time, but at least the first time in current history, a black newspaper threatened to become an authority within itself. And African people began to look at a source of information created by themselves as the source of authority and not a European instrument. Because it becomes very, very dangerous to the status quo when we begin to listen and follow our own authority and our own sources of information. And you can see then the New York Times as it attempted to take back the authority that it had lost through the City Sun, through either the ignoring of that information or by this 2 or 3 page spread that it made concerning these so-called grand jury findings. But it had been wounded, and we must continue to wound it until it is ultimately destroyed. Information is controlled, and I often talk to college students about this. One of the constants that still remains with us and that is intended to remain is what I call the control of the domain of discourse. What does it mean? It only means the control of what it is that is important to talk about. The determination of what is worth talking about, what is worth learning. The European seeks then to control this domain of discourse. What is news? You know, the New York Times then sees itself as what, the paper of record and this and that, which means in a way that it is not news until the New York Times says it's news. It is not news unless it occurs on the major network. Anything that doesn't occur on the major networks that does not make the Eurocentric papers then is not considered news. It is not considered worthy of learning. We see this in college catalogs. I said often many of our students go to college, they look in the catalog, they see the listing of courses, and they assume then that the courses listed there must be worth knowing. If they are not worth knowing and studying, then they wouldn't be in the catalog. Of course, the adverse reasoning is, if it's not in the catalog, then it must be what? Not worth knowing. Is it no coincidence then that the things that are most pertinent to our advancement and liberation as a people is left out of the college catalog, is left out of the news, which then subtly creates in our minds that news that is important to us, news that is relative to us, is unimportant and not worth knowing. So the very design of the catalog, the very news stories that appear in the paper, the very news stories that are projected on the television set create a value system in and of themselves. And the very fact then that certain things are called news and other things are not, then biases information and ultimately biases the very nature of our minds. And ultimately, it biases the very characteristics and capacities and abilities of our minds to operate on that information and future information. The mind also then has some, I wouldn't say innate characteristics, but at least innate potentialities. Those potentialities such as reasoning, logical thinking, critical analysis, comparisons, contrasting, evaluative stuff, these kinds of things, calculating, weighing, measuring, looking at cause and effects, looking at relations, abstracting. Those characteristics are the very operation the mind uses to operate on the world itself, to operate on information, to transform information, to synthesize information, to store information, to compare information, to use information that is ultimately projected in behavior and ultimately projected on the environment. A mind then that cannot look at implications and develop implications, a mind then that cannot perform simple syllogistic reasoning, a mind that cannot perform comparisons, a mind that cannot contrast, a mind that cannot calculate, weigh, and measure, a mind that cannot determine causes and effects, a mind that cannot determine relationships, a mind that cannot perform organization, a mind that cannot perform planning, a mind that cannot evaluate its effect upon the world is a mind then that has no real influence upon the world, and is a mind that has lost control of itself, and is a mind that cannot protect the interests of the personality and the person in which it is a part. This type of mind, this type of structuring is the result, to a good extent, of the nature of the inputs of the mind. And is the nature then, as I said earlier, of the kind of conditions under which the mind operates and lives and exists. One of the reasons then our children have problems often in their thinking skills and reasoning skills. As a side here, I'll say for a moment that we as people can only be in the condition we are in as a result of being robbed of our common sense, as a result of being robbed of our thinking skills, as a result of being emotional and not reasonable, so that our behavior can come under the control of reason and logic, under the control of critical analysis of possibilities and probabilities. It is necessary for the European, in order to control the African mind, to emotionalize that mind. And if you'll note the ads on TV and radio and the other propaganda appeals to which we are subjugated time in and time out, are designed to speak directly to the emotions, not to the rationality of the individual. You can only hypnotize an individual once you get around his critical analytical thinking. And the African then is often emotionalized as a prelude to his behavioral manipulation. So then, it is no accident that our children are placed within certain schools, or as I said earlier, that we are forced to live under certain psychological and physiological circumstances. For it is supposedly in the schools and in the institutions that these inherent characteristics and potentialities of the mind are developed. It is supposedly in the schools that thinking skills and reasoning skills and comparative skills and implicative skills and other skills are trained and developed in the mind so that the mind then can operate autonomously and independently in the world and bring then the world under its will and under its subjugation and protect the individual in the environment and, if necessary, from the environment. But a thinking black man and woman is a dangerous black man and woman. I have to tell you again and again that all of the institutions of the society, I don't care whether you're talking about the family institution, the so-called criminal justice institution, the so-called religious institution, the health institutions, the educational institutions, the economic institutions, all of them have one thing in common, and that is maintaining European domination. And I've said often, and I will say again, that is the reason why when you meet those institutions, they will operate in relationship to you in a way that is the very opposite of what their name implies. And I've said again and again that the church will often send you to hell, that the economic system will keep you poor, that the health system will keep you sick, that the justice system will met out injustice. How else can it maintain the European power if the institutions don't do it? And I'm surprised by how often we are surprised as to why our children are not learning in these schools. We don't understand. In order for us to be in the condition we're in, we must literally be turned backwards as a people. We must be reversed, because this world can only be ruled in terms of lies. When you have a minority of people, a 10% of the world's population, a 10% of the world's population whose lands are not inherently wealthy, whose lands have no natural resources, ruling over the other 90%, then that other 90% must be kept out of its mind. That other 90% must exist in a state of deception. That other 90% must live then in a reversed situation and in a backward situation. Therefore, that other 90% must accept the lie as truth and the truth as lies.